In the second half of 2008, I found myself in what has proven to be the most uncertain time of my life. The economy had just fallen into a deep recession, and it became so difficult to find work where I lived that I was forced to move out of state to find a job. I lived with my grandparents while I saved as much as I could for college, but I knew that doing so was a futile effort, and I wasn't willing to spend the rest of my life under the burden of crushing debt. With voices mounting around me, urging me to forsake my ambitions and pursue a more traditional career path, and under the stress of 65-plus-hour work weeks between two jobs, sometimes I felt like my only reprieve from the anxiety and the doubt that I felt was my Nintendo DS. Fortunately, in November of that year, Chrono Trigger was re-released on that system, and it could not have come into my life at a more perfect time. Just as I began seriously contemplating abandoning my most passionate aspirations, this game inspired me in a way that nothing has before or since. It's because of this game that I moved forward with what I felt inspired to do, rather than what I felt was safe. It's one of the most brilliantly structured, innovative, and passionately crafted video games I've ever played, and I'd like to share with you some of the reasons why it's considered to be one of the greatest games of all time. I find it fascinating that Chrono Trigger was actually envisioned collaboratively between three unlikely giants in the industry. In 1992, during a trip to the United States to conduct research on computer graphics, Hironobu Sakaguchi traveled alongside Yuji Horii, the director and creator of the Dragon Quest series, and Akira Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball. As they traveled, I'm sure they shared various ideas they had in mind for games they'd like to create, and these discussions resulted in the decision to create a game together, one that, as Sakaguchi said specifically at the V-Jump Festival in 1994, no one had done before. The difficulties in organizing such a collaboration proved to be extremely rigorous though, to the point where it began to look like getting the game into development wouldn't be possible. Luckily, Square producer Kazuhiko Aoki stepped in and took it upon himself to make sure that the project moved forward, and with his supervision the details began to fall into place. A team between 50 and 60 people were then assembled to commence with the development of the game, one of which included scenario writer Masato Kato, who had worked previously with Tecmo on the Ninja Gaiden series, and would go on to write the stories for Radical Dreamers, Xenogears, Chrono Cross, and even parts of Final Fantasy VII. With an early draft by Horii in hand, Kato was assigned to write and plan the story, and development officially began in 1993. Early in development, a large majority of the team was assembled into meetings where ideas for what kind of game they should make were discussed openly. Masato Kato has expressed pretty candidly how much he hated this, and obviously felt that trying to be inclusive of so many different ideas was detrimental to getting the project off its feet. During one of these early meetings, though, the inclusion of time travel was suggested, which was at first strongly opposed by Kato, fearing it would lead to boring and repetitious gameplay mechanics. As these meetings progressed, however, it seemed the team won him over. The game was placed under the working title Maru Island, and was originally meant to become a part of the Secret of Mana franchise. It was also planned to be released on the Super Famicom disk drive, but when negotiations between Sony and Nintendo fell through and the SNES CD was cancelled, it caused a lot of problems for the ambitious, expansive RPGs that Square had in the works. With development being reoriented to accommodate cartridges, memory storage limitations became a major issue, and Hiromichi Tanaka, the producer and director of Secret of Mana and Seiken Densetsu 3 respectively, was quoted as saying, "Once everyone learned that the CD-ROM adapter was never going to see a release, they decided to abandon everything that had been planned for development since the very start. But when it was revised, it actually became an entirely different project with an entirely different direction. That was what later on was completed into the game we know as Chrono Trigger." With the restructuring that had to be done in response to this change in hardware, 3 directors from Square were brought on to get the project moving. These included Yoshinori Kitase, who had co-directed Final Fantasy VI, Akihiko Matsui, who had been a battle designer on Final Fantasy IV and V, and Takashi Tokita, who would go on to direct Parasite Eve. As the game began to hit its stride and move forward, the staff had to study and approximate Akira Toriyama's style in order to incorporate new ideas. The final look for the game was meant to be sort of a middle ground between Secret of Mana and Final Fantasy in terms of its color palette and use of light. I wanted to make it something that was neither of those, but still very much a Square game, described Yasuhiko Kamada, who programmed the graphics for the game. So first I thought about the in-between. He also described Ridley Scott's Alien as an inspiration for the way he used light, describing that he found its utilization in conjunction with smoke and atmospheric effects to be very beautiful, and he wanted to translate that feeling into the game. This mixture between light and dark was also manifested in how the writing team approached expressing the story and delivering the vision of the world. This can be seen clearly in the scene where Chrono and Luca battle the dragon tank atop the Guardia Castle dungeon. Against a gloomy sky and a biting, craggy mountain range obscured in shadow, we see our hero leap forward, sword drawn, and deliver a fatal, piercing stab and slice that sends the machine into a fire show of destruction. When you examine this action frame by frame, it's clear that each sprite is carefully crafted to convey the speed, precision, and fury of the attack. This expertly formulated atmosphere is then immediately contrasted with humor, as the Chancellor and two guards attempt to stop the explosion, but find themselves nearly falling through the collapsed stone themselves, hanging on for dear life as they create a human bridge for Chrono and Luca to run across and continue their escape. The animation here, once again, emphasizes the comic nature of this part of the scene. As the dragon explodes, the Chancellor and the guards leap impossibly high, their bug-eyed reactions emphasized by the beads of sweat expulsed from their brows, and the Chancellor's cartoon-like gaping mouth. When examining these two pieces of the same scene separately, it might seem like they couldn't possibly belong together, but somehow it works so beautifully. And I find that the reason for this is because of how perfectly the comedy and drama are balanced throughout the entire game. There are so many serious and even devastating moments, but they're never so serious or so devastating that the comedy feels out of place. And likewise, while there are many whimsical and even eccentric moments, they're never so silly that it diminishes the drama. In my opinion, this is a leading cause for why the game is so overwhelmingly beloved by those who have played it. Whether you tend to prefer thoughtful drama or lively, expressive adventure filled with fun and laughter, Chrono Trigger can deliver what you're looking for. One significant reason why I prefer this game over any of the Final Fantasy games of that time is because the developers completely removed random battles. Of course, Chrono Trigger wasn't the first game to do this, not even among projects within the company. The key difference here is that in other games, while you could see the enemy sprites on the map and choose to engage or avoid them, progress was still briefly halted to load the battle screen. So every time you engaged in a battle, you were taken out of the exploration screen and thrown into a separate battle screen. In Chrono Trigger, however, exploration and battles all take place on the same screen. Secret of Mana also functioned in this way, but it was designed as more of an action game, while Chrono Trigger remained rooted in a menu-based system. It seems that in this case, developing for a cartridge rather than a CD format was a blessing. Though the team was now limited in terms of memory storage, Tanaka went on to say that thanks to the high speed of the ROM, it was possible to seamlessly make the action visible in the field without the need to make a transition into a battle screen. While I love the Final Fantasy series, in every single one, I eventually became fatigued by their battle systems. I've loathed random encounters since my very first experience with the genre, so playing this game for the first time was like a breath of fresh air. I love how often the developers give you the freedom to avoid battles if you want to. This allows the player to focus on exploring dungeons, looking for treasure, and progressing with the story if desired without constant interruption, but also allows for engaging in battles if the player feels it's necessary to level up. And this fits very well into my own playstyle and personal taste. It does need to be said, however, that while there are no random encounters in the game, there are many examples of scripted battles that are completely unavoidable. In my discussions with players online, there are many who consider these scripted battles to be more annoying than random encounters. These kind of battles are much more common in late game areas, which I feel makes sense, but I think it's important to note that this design choice doesn't necessarily jive with everyone. The battle system itself is very straightforward, and many veteran RPG players might find it too easy. I personally feel that this game can be considered a perfect introduction to JRPGs, containing all of the necessary elements for new players to learn and understand the commonly shared features of the genre at an engaging pace without any frustration or annoyance. On this point, I found it interesting that when playtesting the game, one of the most commonly repeated pieces of feedback that Square received was that the game was too hard. In an interview with V-Jump, both Sakaguchi and Hori reminisced about the process for balancing the game, and how the playtesters even accused them of being cruel. This feedback led to the final balancing of the enemies in the current versions, as well as utilizing the Old Man at the end of time as a mechanism to offer hints to the player about what to do next. Character progression takes on more of a classic procedure in this game, rather than the customizable approach that Final Fantasy had made a pillar of its development philosophy by this time. Each character is assigned one elemental affinity, locking them into their own class, for a lack of a better word. Chrono is assigned light magic, Marl ice magic, Luca fire magic, and so on. Some characters are more proficient as melee fighters, others as magic users, so selecting your party becomes an exercise in understanding the kinds of enemies you'll be facing in an area and exploiting their weaknesses accordingly. Level progression works nearly identically here as it does in the mainstay Final Fantasy games, where experience points and ability points, which are called tech points in this game, are earned in battle and slowly accumulate to increase your character's levels as well as unlock new abilities. In this game, however, dual techs and triple techs can be unlocked as well, where 2 or even all 3 of the characters in your active party can link their turns together for a single devastating attack. The animations for these attacks are all really cool, and I've always found unlocking and experimenting with them to be a lot of fun. That being said, I think the largest draw to the game is its storytelling and musical score. I personally love this game's story concept. It's one of the most unique, unpredictable, and well-told stories I've ever seen in a video game. Seeing the world as it evolves and changes over eons just immediately appealed to me. I find it amazing how the world's topography shifts, how the plant and wildlife evolves, how the architecture and fashion progresses. It's simply fascinating to me, the idea of traveling over such enormous stretches of time and seeing the world both as it was and how it will be. That's not to say that there's nothing to criticize, though. While the plot, pacing, and characters really gelled with me, there are some players who feel that the story is a bit too clear-cut, that it doesn't take enough risks or do anything to challenge conventional storytelling. There are many people I've talked to who also feel that there's a striking lack of character development in comparison to Chrono Trigger's contemporaries. While I understand this point of view, I think it's important to affirm that this game does have effective character development. It's just not emphasized nearly as much as it was in Final Fantasy VI, for instance. A lot of this development comes in late-game optional quests, but I would say these scenes certainly contain emotional depth, and do a great job at fleshing out the cast and creating sympathy for their personal stories. Another common criticism I see is that the game is too short. Even on a standard, relaxed playthrough, it's true that the game can be completed in 20 to 25 hours. However, in a world where many games are packed with repetitive, superfluous content to pad the total playtime, I think laser-focused experiences like Chrono Trigger are very refreshing. As much as I love large, expansive RPGs, it's difficult to find hundreds of hours to spend on all of the games I'm interested in. This is why I like how quickly Chrono Trigger can be completed. To me, it never feels like it's lacking content. Its length feels completely appropriate, and every side quest in the game reveals important information about the characters or the world that helps to build a complete, streamlined product. There are no key items or powerful weapons hidden behind annoying minigames, no pointless fetch quests, and no real need for grinding at all. It progresses and flows effortlessly, with a large focus placed on driving the narrative forward. Now, this isn't necessarily true of the DS version of the game, which includes a new monster battling arena, as well as the Lost Sanctum and Dimensional Vortex side quests that could certainly be considered repetitive and frustrating, but when it comes to the SNES version, all of the side content is extremely cohesive. This also plays well into Chrono Trigger's New Game Plus feature, where 13 different endings can be unlocked depending on when you decide to fight the game's final boss. There are also subplots that can be altered depending on specific choices made by the player, and seeing those scenes play out in different forms can be a lot of fun. The argument can be made that these alterations have no groundbreaking implications on the story, but they're nevertheless interesting, and I think it's great that the short duration of the game allows you to go back through and see this bonus content without having to pour another 50+ hours into it. I think it's also important to mention that while this might not have been the first game to include a second playthrough mode, it was the first to call this mode New Game Plus, and pioneered the concept as we understand it in modern gaming. I've also seen it expressed that many players don't like the fact that Chrono is a silent protagonist. This is an interesting point because it was actually heavily debated among the development team as well. Yuji Horii has been vocal throughout his career about his preference for silent protagonists, alleging that having the main character speak alienates the player. In his view, since the main character is an extension of the player, he doesn't understand why the character would suddenly speak of his or her own accord. In Horii's words, the player will be struck with the realization that the character he's been thinking of as himself up until now is actually someone else entirely. Yoshinori Kitase later recalled these disputes in an interview with GSLA, where he said, "We argued a lot with Yuji Horii over whether Chrono should speak or not. Horii said that the protagonist of an RPG must never speak, and at Square, opinions were divided on the issue. We eventually decided to go with a hero who doesn't speak, but once that decision was made, it greatly changed the way we were constructing the event scenes." Hearing the developers talk about it, I feel I can understand both sides of the debate, and I can see the merits of each approach. When it comes to the main character being an avatar for the player, an extension of the person playing the game, I can certainly understand opting for a silent protagonist in games with high levels of character customization. For games like The Elder Scrolls, Dark Souls, and Dragon Age, where you customize not only your character's class and abilities, but also their appearance, Horii's ideas make complete sense to me. These characters are clearly meant to represent the player in the world. In games like this, I agree that it would be strange to have the character speak, and would break the immersion that all of the customization options were built to achieve. It also makes sense to me that in games like The Witcher, Final Fantasy, or the first Xenoblade Chronicles, where this same level of customization and control over the characters is not given to the player, it's a consequence of the game being structured around the characters created by the developer to service the story, and the player isn't meant to assume a role within that story. Of course, this isn't necessarily a hard rule for every game, seeing as I've always agreed with the choice to make Link a silent protagonist despite the fact that the player has no control over his appearance or abilities. And I can say the same thing about several of the Dragon Quest games. On the inverse, I agreed with the choice to make the player avatar speak in Fire Emblem Awakening. It really all depends on the kinds of stories you like in the games you play, and your personal preference on how character development should be handled. In this case, I think having Chrono as a silent protagonist is fitting within the way the game is presented. One thing I personally didn't love about the SNES version of the game, though, was the script. Ted Woolsey was selected to complete the translation, and I've mentioned numerous times my distaste for his approach in the games he worked on for Square. With Chrono Trigger in particular, I strongly disliked his choices for Frog. In the original version of the game, Frog is meant to have an early modern English mode of speech, like what you would read in the King James Bible. The problem is that in many instances, Woolsey wrote this dialogue incorrectly. For example, "Will thee accompany me" should actually read "Wilt thou accompany me?" The other problem I have with this choice is that while Frog speaks this way, no one else from his time period does. This lack of continuity frustrated me as well. Luckily, in the DS version of the game, this has been revised. While Frog no longer speaks with an early modern English mode, he does retain an elevated method of speech. And the best part is that this is carried over into how all the other people of that time period speak as well. For this reason alone, I always recommend the DS version to new players rather than the SNES version. Of all of the development stories surrounding this game, however, the one that hits the closest to home for me is that of composer Yasunori Mitsuda. In most areas of my life, I try to live in such a way where I seek to understand the world from a strict analytical perspective. I don't like to make choices or build my worldviews based on how I feel about things. The one area in my life where the opposite is true is in my love and appreciation of music. Music for me is a metaphysical experience. It's not something I can describe sufficiently with words, because it's not something I can quantify. It's only something I can feel. And my passion for music is beyond what I can rationally, demonstrably illustrate. This makes it really difficult for me to write these portions of my reviews where I talk about the music of these classic RPGs without using cliches like, the music always perfectly fits the environment, or the score always hits the right tone for the scene. The problem with this kind of analysis is that it never adequately expresses what I actually feel when I experience this music. And in this case, I refuse to use such platitudes. I think it'll be far more effective to tell the story of Yasunori Mitsuda instead, and allow you to imagine what he must have felt as he poured his entire heart and soul into this soundtrack. At the time just before Chrono Trigger's development began, Yasunori Mitsuda had been hired as a sound programmer, where he had worked as an engineer for Hanjuku Hero, Final Fantasy V, Secret of Mana, and Romancing Saga 2. Having come to the company shortly after his studies at a junior college of music, his true ambition was to compose. However, with a salary that left him unable to support himself, as well as his growing displeasure with his opportunities within the company, Mitsuda felt he had no other choice than to go up to the office of Hironobu Sakaguchi and deliver an ultimatum. If he wasn't given a composing job, he would quit. Sakaguchi responded by saying, "In that case, you should do Chrono Trigger, and after you finish, maybe your salary will go up." Mitsuda did not take this opportunity lightly. Drawing upon what he had already written, he began evaluating the scenes from Chrono Trigger and deciding which of these songs he could use and which he would have to create from scratch. In doing so, he drove himself to the utter limits of his physical strength, often sleeping in his office and awaking with inspiration that he would immediately begin working on. The main theme from the game, appropriately titled Chrono Trigger, was one that he claims to have written in one sitting. I just couldn't contain my excitement at finally being able to write music. The day after I was told, "Well, we're leaving it up to you," the final version was just about finished. I think the feeling of careening along in the intro part is all my pent-up desire to be a composer finally bursting into existence. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said I could never adequately explain my experience with music. Can you imagine the thrill Mitsuda was feeling in this moment? Can you imagine what it would be like after so many years to finally be living out your dreams? I can, because I can actually feel those emotions in the Chrono Trigger theme when I listen to it. It's as if Mitsuda's joy, exhilaration, and satisfaction are being transferred into my own heart. I can feel his passion and his complete dedication to excellence in this score. It is an absolutely brilliant soundtrack, one that is packed with emotion and a unified, contemplative melodic structure. In my opinion, there is no soundtrack that rivals it in gaming. Unfortunately, his experience was not nearly as blissful after that. In recalling what the process was like, he said that in the beginning, the music was ahead of everything, but towards the end, everyone had passed me by. Around December 20th of last year, when I needed so much more music all at once, I was at a total loss. I stayed at my office for 4 days without sleep to write the music for the last sub-boss, but I really wanted to run away. As if that wasn't enough, Mitsuda recounts suffering a hard drive crash in which he lost 40 tracks that were in progress. Despite this, Mitsuda remained absolutely committed to writing quality music. Instead of arranging short themes that would loop after 1 minute, like most other games did at that time, Mitsuda pledged to write music that would last at least 2 minutes before looping, so that the player would never get sick of hearing it. He also felt that too much of the music being composed for video games at that time lacked consistency, so he became determined to employ leitmotif in the score in the same way that it was utilized in his favorite films. However, with all of that stress looming over him, and the incredible workload he took upon himself, it's no surprise that Mitsuda eventually developed stomach ulcers and became too sick to finish the soundtrack on his own. Luckily, Nobuo Uematsu, famed composer of the Final Fantasy series, was able to step in and finish 10 tracks for him, with one track being written by Noriko Matsueda. Once the game had been finished and the staff was called together to preview their work, Mitsuda admits that he wept openly and said that many of the other staff members were equally moved. Given how much the team sacrificed, and especially with how much Mitsuda gave of himself to the project, it isn't surprising at all that this was their response to seeing the final product. After years of incredibly hard work, the vision and ambition of Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yuji Horii, Akira Toriyama, Masato Kato, and so many others had been realized. The dream project, as it was often described, had finally been completed. I can only imagine the sense of accomplishment they must have felt with all the setbacks and complications they faced during the development cycle. I think Mitsuda put it best though, simply stating, "I think all of us put a lot of emotion into the game." I, for one, can feel that passion when I play this game, more so than with any other game I've played. It was that devotion to their craft, that dedication to excellence, and the fervor and zeal with which the project was created that inspired me in my time of doubt. Because of their hard work, I was touched in a way that changed the course of my life. and I now live with the dream of inspiring others in the same way with my own work. It's because of this that I can say without hesitation that Chrono Trigger is a masterpiece, and by far my favorite video game of all time.